business cycles. Yeah. The business cycles.
I've always found the idea of staying at a company for a long time appealing. In retrospect, I think my over-identification with work played into this. If I'm honest, I can even see times when I was starting out where I projected the family construct onto my work life a little bit. That being said, even children grow up and leave home at some point, right? Well, they're supposed to. I started my career at two of the largest and most successful companies in New York, Tiffany's and New York University. Both were founded in the 1830s, just like going to blow some people's minds, and had no shortage of employees with double-digit tenure. In fact, I worked with a colleague at NYU in the 90s who's still there and has over 50 years with the university. That's like just insane.
Whoa.
Shout out to Steve.
Wow.
I
Steve,
might have
go
stayed
Steve.
and very happy and very, very much ingrained. And you can imagine the institutional knowledge over 50 years, right?
Yeah.
He's a wonderful guy. But you're not going to find that anymore. That's obsolete. I might have stayed at Tiffany's the rest of my career if I hadn't been headhunted by a top tier consulting firm. Their first offer was 75% increase to my salary. So it was like a no-brainer there. But I love the firm. Consulting felt like the best of both worlds. You cycle through projects at different clients, but you still have your core family that stays a constant. And without going down a rabbit hole about consulting, I'll say that there are a number of career paths. And as I was growing quickly, none of them at the time really seemed to appeal to me in exactly the right way. So I started my own consultancy business and went happily off on my own. As a change expert, I am somewhat allergic to rote, repetitive kinds of work. New puzzles to solve excite me, and I love being forced to continually learn and solve new problems. It was interesting to see the workforce dynamics at large organizations where there were both long-tenured employees as well as those who had joined like last week. And in my experience, this often creates like almost microcultures and inter-cohort dynamics. Like sometimes a board will make a sweeping leadership change at the top of the house, which results in widespread leadership changes, which end up trickling down across the organization. And then what happens? Well, leaders bring in their trusted people, their friends that they've worked with throughout their career. And those people then bring in their people and so on and so on. It's not uncommon for the folks who've been at an organization a really long time to experience these changes with fear and even anger. I've heard terms like corporate invaders used. No one wants someone outside the family coming into their house and changing how things are done. Conversely, the new folks, armed with their marching orders from new leadership, are often heard to say things like, well, this is how we did it at, enter whatever company name there.
Yeah.
The subtext screams, you guys have been here too long admiring these problems. I come from a place where we already solved them years ago, in fact. Step aside, you're part of the problem, and I'm here as the solution. Well, you can imagine how well that plays out. As a change practitioner, this is all fascinating stuff, and we can do an entire podcast on how these types of dynamics can undermine complex change and transformation initiatives. But I guess my point here is that in terms of retaining talent and keeping talent fresh, there's a sweet spot to be found. And the same holds true for employees. If you bounce around too much, you'll likely not benefit from lessons which only come over time. And your brand will suffer as recruiters worry that you have commitment or performance problems.
We did a 2-part episode on shame in our first season, and I think it's worth considering how shame gets embedded in so-called standards of a career. I can remember early in my career when a lot of jumps or hops on a resume would lower a candidate's market value. Now there's a case to be made that demonstration of rapid ascension and multiple logos on your LinkedIn increase your appeal versus a candidate with over a decade in one company with like 1 or 2 promotions, previously normal. It's seen as lacking, the virtues of like hustle, ambition, and demonstration of growth. A lot of what we talk about on the show is, building a career iteratively by figuring out what works best for you. And this, at some point, is going to involve confronting some long-held standards that serve to fence you in, and stepping outside of them can be very scary. As you just outlined, Mary, a career can take many twists and turns. If you focus on setting yourself up to play in, games you can win versus buying into the narrative to tough it out in conditions that both suck and are conducive for your growth, where I think the long-term prospectus on that, like, ultimately, it's kind of, you wind up figuring out it doesn't work when it's a little bit too late to be able to build a strategy, or at least, you're later in the game. So, to that point, I have a slightly different path. Early in my career, I started at Eli Lilly. And when I left, people questioned my sanity. And to be fair, they were kind of right. I wasn't doing so hot. I mean, actually, episode 2, I actually made a series of decisions where I chose jobs where I was initially making, where I would ultimately initially make less money than the previous one. But I knew the conditions were increasingly better suited for me. I wanted to plant myself in soil where I could thrive, and I was learning to build my capability. I mean, one example of this is like moving from Eli Lilly to a smaller pharmaceutical company where I knew I could be more innovative, and then continuing to iterate off of that. And I won't go into all the details here in the interest of time, but I like to say that I'm the Gen Z prototype. I was working in Bali before it was a thing, leaving jobs to further self-actualize myself before that was a thing. And you know what? I'll speak for myself. It's, worked out pretty great.
And we'll be right back.
If you learn to trust yourself and bet on yourself, the capacity to take risks and build a life on your own terms, it builds over time. But be patient, brick by brick. Or if you remember What About Bob with Bill Murray, it's just all about taking baby steps.
Awesome movie. Great quote, by the way. Another
baby steps.
The best movie ever. If you haven't seen it, like, homework.
Oh my God. Everybody,
everyone must
stop
watch
what you're
that.
doing.
Okay.
So making decisions that make sense for you, but not others, it's not for the faint of heart. For example, oh my gosh, yeah. For example, when I left Eli Lilly, I was having dinner with a family member and her partner at the Top of the Hub restaurant in Boston. Rest in peace to the institution. And when she left, she got up from the table to go use the restroom. Her partner looked me dead in the eye and said, "I'm successful in business, and that is why I can see you don't have what it takes to succeed." And my response had been, "That's interesting that you consider yourself successful." But also, side note, not to say that was actually something that felt good. I'm sassy, but it was also kind of just like, Jesus. And a side note to that story is their hatred of me had just been sparked because I had called them out for mistreating the server. And they literally said, "Do you know who I am?" When the server walked away, amongst other things. And when the server walked away, I told them both, I couldn't live with myself if I didn't point out that what you just did was like so uncalled for.
And you all ate a lot of saliva in that meal.
Right? Like, by association, I was probably like stuck in the spit train, headed for Spit Town and a suburb of Spit Philadelphia. So, and but now that I think about it, recalling that this same person many years later used my success to shame someone else, like in a pattern as old and predictable as time itself. We were sitting around a table and he told someone, and this is paraphrased, he said to someone, he goes, "This is why you don't have what it takes to be successful like Katie." And look, I'm bringing up this example because it's important to remember that people who don't believe in you and express it without any constructive content are just showing you their own festering wounds and has nothing to do with you. You know, if someone who knows you cares for you says, "Hey, I think this is an area where you would struggle because of XYZ, and here are my thoughts on an alternative or a workaround," that's interesting to me. If you only have the vision to point out faults, but not to recognize opportunity or be interested in putting some elbow grease in to, support me, I'm checking your receipts. And if you are not more successful and happier than me, your perspective is handicapped accordingly.
What did you used to say? If you don't have, I know this is a bigger quote, but you've said it before, which is like, if you don't take advice from someone whose life you don't want.
Don't take directions from somebody who's lost.
Right.
Like, that's my thing. And and the thing is people that are in the business of like enjoying giving advice, and actually I would say time has further like endowed me with conviction on this, is like my lack of interest in giving advice has like spiked in the more I've been qualified to give it, or even guidance or criticism or pointing out like you're doing it wrong or whatever. It's like, now I know, it's like if somebody's like air quotes doing it wrong, I'm like, yeah, that's kind of part of the process. Like,
Yes.
People are kind of figuring out their thing. And like the thing about like making mistakes, like going to the wrong job or, it's like, don't do that. It's like, yeah, you know what? Like I went to a lot of wrong jobs. I went through all that stuff. And so, as far as like feeling that just like viewing somebody at like one point in time, that you're in a position to like be able to like take, the sort of, interim captain role. I mean, it's,
Well, it's like the therapy model, right? Like therapists don't give prescriptive advice, and yet there's so many, good ones anyway. But before, like, I'm having some thoughts, but like, first off, can we just say that like being shitty to servers or anyone working in service, I mean, it's just like a big non-negotiable for me. And this is coming from someone who has like extraordinary service expectations. Like there are contact center databases where I have like an asterisk next to my name, I'm sure. I world-class operations, right? Like, so I know what's achievable. So I'm pretty volatile when those expectations aren't met, but it's not the server's fault when things aren't happening. I went to a lunch with a work colleague years ago, and she was so sweet. We were both in our 20s, and she, like, it was just like a totally different person. And she like berated the server repeatedly. I think she ordered like a hamburger, and she's like, "No, that's not no." And they kept serving it. And then she's like, by that time I was like done. And she's like, "No, I don't like it." It was, I wanted to die. So different in context to how she acted at work, and really the end of our relationship. We should do an episode on that too. But anyway, you're right. I think you're right, Katie. Career building, it's iterative, and there's self-searching in it. And then you change throughout this period of time too. And so every person, they're going to have their own risk threshold. And that's something which is going to change. If you're single without kids in your 20s and 30s, you can probably shoulder a little more risk that comes with, job hopping and work gaps. If you're in midlife, even without a family, maybe you're starting to evaluate your retirement strategy, but all of that's very, very, very personal. And I think you bring up a really good point about who you look to for advice. I mean, the answer, of course, is the business psychos. Kidding. Not a little bit. But your example, I think, shows how interpersonal dynamics will color perceptions and distort or even negate advice. So too will biases. So for example, I have a relatively conservative risk profile, so my advice is going to skew slightly that way. And then there's the bias which comes from those who will be impacted by your decision, like to leave a job. So obviously, having that conversation with your boss, it's a great example. Like, maybe you do have a really cool one who's able to be somewhat objective, and you go and say, "Hey, I really want to go here. I have a competing offer or whatever," and maybe they can be objective and wish you the best, but maybe not. So I think all of this is to say, take everything for a grain of salt. And by the way, there's like broader market considerations like the ones we've discussed previously. Starting your own business in a recession, maybe not a great idea, but a very personal. Even though this is like a business podcast, we kind of go into this like kind of other spaces sometimes, and like there's advice, and then there's, like, to your point, like there's the journey. Like the right answer is in the mistake. Like you're not going to find the answer unless maybe you go through that. Like avoiding it isn't the answer.
Kind of wild. Kind of a side note. So I was in a sorority in college, and there's Hell Week, which is now, verboten. But it was like psychological torture, sleep deprivation, all sorts of head games. And I like when I went through Hell Week, I was like, you should meet my mother. You guys are weak.
Like, I have a PhD in Hell Week.
Yeah, no, like they couldn't. Like part of it is they're supposed to break you, and I just like wouldn't break. I'm like, listen, I studied with the masters. Like you guys can't like listen. You guys, this
I
is
would
like
never. The Hell Week is why I would never, even in a million years, I would have considered.
See, this is actually something that's interesting. It's exactly why I want to do it.
Yeah,
no,
I would be.
This is about. Let's see what you guys got. It's all games, so it was like like it's not positioned that way, but
seems like a lot of humiliation. Seems like there's like a lot of humiliation.
Oh yeah, it's like the attempt because they're trying to like do all sorts of dumb fake stuff. But after I became a sister, because then you participate in it, and I like had no interest in it. There were some, there was like a very significant subset of sisters that really enjoyed the process of being in the power seat for Hell Week. And so the pledge class that came after me, there was this one girl who was like just a broken puddle. She was a pledge. And I totally broke ranks and like supported her and like had one-off conversations with her. You're not supposed to. Like, it's actually like, no, you don't. And the thing that stuck with me for, honestly, decades afterwards was this same, I'm just going to use her name. Her name is Cheryl. Okay, come get me, Cheryl.
Hey, Cheryl.
Yeah. No, get ready. Is that once she became a sister, she was one of the most vicious people in the room during Hell Week. As a formative, I was probably 19, 20 when that happened. For me, that was really formative to really to see that like very clear demonstration of how the cruelest people are the weakest and the strongest people are the kindest. And so it's like, even going back to that thing, it's like if I see somebody, to your point, like you had a relationship that ends because somebody is like cruel because they have the upper hand in the power dynamic and absolutely just like use it to like just like kick the throttle into gear. It's like you just know something that is like that's like goes kind of bone spirit deep with the person. So I don't need to do like more exploration here.
You can't unsee it. You can't unsee it. And it's so character defining. It's so there are some things like, I mean, I've been an asshole. Like I've made mistakes. I've whatever, and I've either owned them then or soon after. I've apologized for things even years later. But then there are some things which are just so character defining.
Exactly.
It's
an important point that when you're weak, when you need to have power over other people to feel powerful, you're a liability, for the emotional safety of other people. And so I don't like do this. I mean, it's coming off more as like more of a call out than I'd want it to be. But, when we're talking about people who are either A, being overtly cruel to people who are not in the position to fight back, or secondly, to people who are at like some point right now, like questioning, would this be selfish for me to do this thing, to invest in growing myself? That's my other part of this, which is like, absolutely not. Swing for the fences. Like your greatest version of yourself is like so extraordinary for the people in your community, the people around you, the people who love you, the people you work with. It's like, yes, I say yes, go for it.
Hey, fellow psychos, if you enjoyed the show, please click like, subscribe, and share it with other psychos you know. We'd also love to hear from you, so please hit us up on our socials. We're at Business Psychos Pod on Instagram, YouTube, and Facebook.